We tend to divide history up according to the kings and queens and the families of kings and queens, because being king and queen goes from father to son or father to daughter. It goes through the generations. So we tend to group things in terms of the families. The family name here is Tudor, and they were the kings and queens of England from 1485 to 1603. And the first of them was Henry VII. We'll spend a bit of time on him, but he's not the really famous one. The one everybody knows is Henry VIII, Henry Hasse. He's the big name. So we'll spend rather more time on Henry VIII, but let's just get started by looking at his father. Okay, so the Wars of the Roses, so-called Barasenso, somebody's trying to contact me, but they can't. Go away. We start with this man, Edward III, because he was the head of a big medieval family that controlled England for hundreds of years during the Middle Ages. And from him, these Wars of the Roses, these two branches of his family, divided. So I'll go back to him also because of the medieval kings of England, he was the most powerful. He was also a very nasty person. Okay, you wouldn't want to get too close to him. There were a lot of nasty people around in those days. While he was the leader of the country in the 14th century, he brought England into a very kind of powerful position. It became one of the most powerful countries in Europe. We looked a little bit at England in the Middle Ages. It wasn't, on the whole, a very important country. By the time we get to the Tudors, England is really not terribly important at all. But under Edward, it became quite a strong country. Half of France at this time belonged to England, because the Normans were French. So they had lands in France. When they came to England, they added to their territory, and they developed their lands in France. And under this man, Edward III, the lands in France grew bigger and stronger, and various parts of Europe, that kind of western corner of Europe, were under English control. He also took quite strong control of Scotland at that time, although later again Scotland broke free and so on. So he's a powerful person, and he had two of his sons. One of whom was called John of Gaunt, and the other was Edmund, the Duke of York. Now these two ended up having two separate families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, and these two families were represented by a red rose and a white rose, and that's why the fighting between those two families became called the Wars of the Roses. It wasn't just one war, it wasn't just one battle or anything. It went on. There would be some fighting, and one of them would get killed, and the other side would become king. And then a few years later, there'd be a bit more fighting, and the king would get killed again, and it would be the other side. So they were fighting between them for control of the country. They're these two families. And so the Wars of the Roses go back to this 14th century king, Edward. Now, Henry Tudor, the man that we're talking about at the moment, was actually from the House of Lancaster. And just before him, there had been a king called Richard III. And he was pretty unpopular. I'm not quite sure why he was so unpopular. We'll come to that later on. There are several possible reasons for his unpopularity. But he was a Yorkist king. He was from the House of York, and he was killed in that year 1485, and that's when Henry VII took control. Now, when Henry VII became king, he managed to end the Wars of the Roses. How did he do it? Well, he went to Richard's niece, okay, that's May, okay, his Richard's brother's daughter, and said to her, look, お父さんのことごめんね。お父さんじゃなくて、おじさんのことごめんね。結婚しよう. That might seem a bit strange if somebody killed your uncle to marry you, but this sort of thing was happening quite often in those days. And that's what happened here. She said, it's an eel. I didn't really like him very much anyway. So, or something like that. And so that's it. You know, she married him. So the two families were now united through this marriage. Okay, she was York, from the House of York. He was from the House of Lancaster. They married and united the two houses. So that changed the Jidai was called the Plantagenet Jidai. The two families together were the Plantagenets, and that ended at that time. Now, exactly what Richard was like, we don't know. There's a big debate about it even today. But in Shakespeare's play, he's shown as a hunchback. This guy who goes around like this. Okay? And not only does he go around like this, but according to Shakespeare and some other people, he killed his two nephews. Okay? The two little princes, two little boys. Okay? He kept them in the Tower of London, prisoner, and then one night he sent his guards in and killed them. Richard III. You're not my nephew, are you? You're not my nephew. You wouldn't want to be my nephew, would you? No, you wouldn't want to be my nephew, all right? A bit of a risk, okay? That's the story, okay? It's not quite true it's not quite sure if it's really true or not, but that's something that Shakespeare believed and that was widely believed, that Richard murdered his two nephews to stop them from being king in the future. Because of the Wars of the Roses, close family members, in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, they will try to be king. So more fighting, and Richard, to protect himself, killed his close relatives. That's the story, that's the belief. Okay? Whether it's true or not is quite widely debated. But one thing we do know is that his bones were found just a few years ago, quite recently, in an old car park, okay, that was at the site of, there'd been a church, and the church was gone, and there was a car park. They were working on the car park, and they dug away, and they found some bones. They figured out it was Richard III. Okay, so we've got physical proof now. We know what he would have looked like. He would have had his right shoulder raised, and he's shown in pictures of the time as having his right shoulder raised. He wouldn't have had a hunchback, so it's not exactly true. It's more like his shoulder, not his back. Okay, so in fact, if you look at the picture here, you can see, all right, the right shoulder is raised up. Okay, and yes, it's the old site of an old church. It's now a car park, and that's where he was found. So history is, we're learning new things all the time. Richard III's bones were dug up. So at the start of his reign, his marriage. And this is bringing together the two houses, Lancaster and York, and the Plantagenet dynasty, the Plantagenet kind of family group that included the houses of Lancaster and York. That dynasty now came to an end. So it's like a new Jidai, a new period. And it's a new period in other ways as well. It's also, roughly speaking, the end of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, Chusei Jidai, in Europe are usually calculated on the basis of that pyramid social structure that we talked about last week with the, okay, you've got the king at the top, you've got his peers, the knights and everything, and you've got the ordinary people here, the serfs, at the bottom of the social structure. And the serfs are pretty close to being like slaves. From the time they're born to the time they die, they have to serve their masters. And that system is, roughly speaking, the Middle Ages system. When that social system comes to an end, we stop talking about the Middle Ages, which is not quite the same time as the Tudors. It's about the middle of the 15th century, about 1450, we'd say that the Middle Ages pretty much have ended in England. So the things that are bringing about the end of the Middle Ages, the end of that social structure, all right, with the serfs at the bottom. The formation of the English language. Remember those two languages coming together, it took about 400 years or so. So by the time those two languages had come together, that social structure had ended and a new period was beginning. We call it the early modern period. We are studying the early modern period. And the first major dynasty of the early modern period, the first major family of kings and queens is the Tudor family. So the two languages have come together, and the Normans as a group don't really exist. Nobody would say, I'm Norman, okay, in the same way as in Japan. Nobody would say, I'm Yayoyo, I'm Jomon or something. That was much longer ago, of course, but we still do have distinctions in Britain. As we said last week, people will say, I'm Celtic, I'm not Anglo-Saxon. That distinction is very important, but the Normans just got kind of mixed in the end with the Saxon people. So there wasn't really any difference by the middle of the 15th century. And then you got the long struggles of the Wars of the Roses, and because of those struggles, the high class people, because they've been fighting each other, okay, they've been fighting each other so much, they had weakened themselves. They weren't as strong as they were. And so in exchange, the merchant classes, the middle classes, the traders and skilled workers, they were becoming more powerful. So the elite that had been there in the Middle Ages was still the elite, but it wasn't quite so absolutely powerful as it had been in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. It was slowly weakening, and the skilled workers and the merchants and so on, they were becoming more powerful. And I don't think I mentioned it on the print, but there was also a big thing that went on, peseto, in the 14th century. Wiped out a huge number of people. And when those people were replaced, the social system had to change. That's another reason why the merchant classes and so on rose up, because so many people were killed. We need skilled people, we need skilled people. Well, pay us better and we'll do the work for you. Pay us better. So they're getting more money and they're getting more competition. Instead of staying in the same place and working for the same master all their lives, it's, oh, we can get better money over here. We can move around, okay? We've got more power than we used to have because we're in demand, okay? So that's another reason why the merchant classes were getting stronger at this time. So basically that period, the 15th century, the middle of the 15th century, society is going through a kind of watershed change. And of course, it's not like people wake up one morning and say, oh, I'm not Chusei any longer, I'm early modern. It's not like that. But roughly speaking, the middle of the 15th century is the kind of turning point from the Middle Ages kind of society and social structure to early modern. And of course, you've got the Renaissance. The Renaissance. People used to say Renaissance. Nowadays, they more often say early modern. Okay, but it basically covers the same period. Okay, the early modern period and the Renaissance period, 大体同じ意味です. Okay, just it's not so fashionable anymore to call it the Renaissance. We tend to call it the early modern period. Okay. So the rules and policies of Henry. What did he do? What kind of king was he? Well, the first thing he needed to do is to make his power strong, to consolidate, to make strong, to consolidate his power. So he had a clever idea there. He said, after the battle, he became king. But he says, I became king the day before the battle. So everybody who was in the battle fighting against me was fighting against the king. Fighting against the king is punishable by death. I could kill you guys if I want you to, all you people who were against me. But because I'm a nice guy, as long as you're good, I won't kill you. All right, but technically, I could. So he made this idea that he was king from the day before the battle, just so that he could have stronger power over his enemies. What else did he do? Well, in a lot of ways, he was a good king who stabilized his country. He didn't like war and fighting. He liked trade agreements and developing the markets. So he made trade agreements with France and Holland, the Netherlands, it's the same thing. He was good with money. He was pretty kibishi, pretty strict about taxation, zeiking. So he built up the country's economy, and he also made it a time of peace. Because when people are buying things from each other, they tend usually not to kill each other. All right? So that was his idea. And it was working very nicely. He also managed to make an alliance with Scotland because his daughter married the Scottish king, James Stuart. And yokomite kudasai, Stuart is the next dynasty after the Tudors. So this marriage is very important. 120年ぐらい後 Okay, 120年間ぐらい後で when Queen Elizabeth dies, about 120 years later, she's got no children. So the closest shinseki, the closest relative, is the son, grandson, great-grandson of this marriage. Okay, so great-great-grandson. So I can't remember now. It's great or great. Anyway, several generations down the line, the Stuart descendant is the nearest relative, and he will become King of England later on. So this is the reason why the King of Scotland, King James, later became the King of England. And he made an alliance with Spain through the marriage of his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon. So both children made very successful marriages, joining the country together, joining Scotland and England together through marriage. They didn't unite, they didn't become one country, they're still two separate countries, but they're friendly now. Again, you don't go killing somebody when their queen is your daughter, and go fighting people who, if your country is joined together by marriage, then that's better than having to fight. And the same was true with Spain. And Germany, he made an alliance separately. So he was pretty good at making friends internationally. Well, what happened when he died? What did he leave behind? And what somebody leaves behind them when they die is called their legacy. And his legacy, what he left behind, was pretty positive in a lot of ways. He had a lot of money himself, and his country was also rich. unfortunately, his son was not so good with money. His son squandered that money, he spent it very quickly. And his son was not so good with the economy. His son did not keep the economy working so well as the father. Mostly because the son enjoyed war and he spent a lot of money fighting in other countries. So that quickly used up the money that his father had saved. These two marriages, as I say, were very, very important because the daughter's marriage to James IV meant that the Stuarts would later become kings of England. Not immediately, not for more than 100 years, but in the end, the Stuarts become kings of England. And the marriage to the Spanish princess, also very important. Now, I say that Catherine of Aragon married Arthur, but nobody remembers Arthur because he died. Okay, he was, I think, 15 years old or something, he just died. If he's 15 and married, well, yes, in those days, yes. Okay. So, shortly after she married him, Arthur died. So, Catherine is left with no husband. What's she going to do? Well, everybody remembers that Catherine of Aragon married Henry VIII. That's the marriage that everyone. Nobody thinks about Arthur because poor kid, he died shortly after marrying her. So basically, big brother dies, little brother marries big brother's wife. Okay? We'll move on to that when we talk about Henry later in a little while. Do we get the picture then? This man who has stabilized the country economically, he's united the two families that were fighting against each other, he's built up trading and international relations, and he's married his two children to two very important creating a relationship with Scotland and with Spain. So basically that's all we really need to know about Henry VII. Okay? Henry VIII, much more complicated figure. It's going to take us a lot of time to work through Henry VIII. Okay?